So Herzl was the figurehead for what's generally called political Zionism, right? Because his focus is on the state and basically nothing else. But there's another version of Zionism that is called cultural Zionism. And so this is a group of people that Haam is really the figurehead for, who thought it wouldn't be that easy to create a Jewish state. That, first of all, politically, it wouldn't just happen with no problems. But that, second of all, Jews were really diverse. They had been scattered all over the world. They had very different lifestyles, different cultures, and different languages. Language is a really big issue. That Herzl didn't care what language Jews spoke. He kind of advocated for French or German, as these were sort of high-class bourgeois languages all over Europe. But Ahad said, no, like there actually has to be a unity within a nation to call it a nation. And that because of being forced to live in the diaspora, which he sees much more as an exile, to use a kind of older cultural and religious category, that Ahad says basically no, that he writes this article called "This Is Not the Way" that we read, right? So certainly he's not mincing words about how much he dislikes Herzl's version of Zionism and how pessimistic he is about what Herzl's kind of utopian ideas could mean. And so instead, first of all, he's part of a vibrant Jewish life in Eastern Europe. He knows how a lot of people live either or what we might call Orthodox Jewish lives, or just a lot of other political forms and things like that. He's more familiar with all of what's happening in Eastern Europe, which is where about 80% of Jews living in the world were in this time period. So Herzl's saying, Ahad is saying that what Jews really need is to rebuild their culture. So he thinks that, for one, the Hebrew language will help. Hebrew had not been the spoken language of Jews since the destruction of the Second Temple, but people, of course, did know it. It's the language that the Bible is in. It's the language that a lot of commentaries are written in. It's a literary language for many, many Jews. And so he along with others, basically says, like, let's reinvigorate it into a spoken language. And so people take up Hebrew, and he wants to argue that to really be a language, he's part of a movement all over Europe, especially Eastern Europe, that thinks that a language isn't really legitimate unless it can be literary. So Ahad is contributing to newspapers. He tries to write an encyclopedia. He's doing all these different kinds of things, and he's doing them in Hebrew. In fact, Ahad is his pen name that means one of the people. So he takes this Hebrew name that really he wants to kind of not have it be about his personality. He wants to just be one of the people, but to say, if Jews are going to suddenly come together, that they're going to have to overcome a lot of their differences, a lot of the experiences of anti-Semitism. He argues, that having experienced anti-Semitism is not going to be that easy to get over, that it will have had effects on people, that it will take time to sort of no longer internalize the hatred that they've experienced from anti-Semitism. He's not hopeful in the way that Herzl is, that anti-Semitism will just go away. He locates it in different causes. And he says that basically assimilation is the problem of Jews in Western Europe. Assimilation is not the problem of Jews in Eastern Europe. And so for him, cultural Zionism has to address the needs of Jews living in very different contexts. So he says for Jews in Western Europe, the problem is spiritual, that they're alienated from what it's actually like to live a Jewish life, to live a life where most of the people they know are Jewish, in their towns, things like that, that Jews are certainly living in urban settings, in towns, and even in big cosmopolitan cities, even in major cities. So, for example, Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, was 50% Jewish before the war. Um, so we're talking about a lot of places, a lot of experiences where Jews have perhaps been a national minority, but in terms of their kind of public culture and daily life, they have not really lived as minorities. That they've lived vibrant Jewish lives. Many of them have been a part of Orthodox Judaism, which for a Haam is not essential going forward. He says if people want to do religion, like, fine, but he's critical of it. He thinks it's become really stale, that it's not compelling for people. And he thinks this is partially because it's been in the diaspora, and that by a return to Palestine and a reinvigoration of Hebrew and a renaissance of Jewish literature, that Jewishness will become more compelling. So he says it's possible to be Jewish nationally and culturally without participating in religion. For those who do participate in religion, that it necessarily should be tied to nation and culture. And so in that way, he's deeply critical of the Reform movement. He says that the Reform movement has only made everything worse, that it's alienated Jews even more from Jewishness, and in the name of assimilation. He hates Reform Judaism. So Hadam doesn't necessarily think that Jews have to have a state. He says that Jews have to get ready for a state because they're not really a nation, that they've retained a sense of peoplehood, in part due to anti-Semitism, but in part due to having been connected to each other, but that to really live together and live a rich national life, that Jews are going to have to begin to do these cultural things all over the world. Unlike Herzl, he also doesn't think that a majority of Jews are going to want to move to the land of Palestine, but Hadam says that's fine. That's actually going to be one of the really important roles that Palestine will play for Jews all over the world, is that it can be a kind of center where a Jewish national culture will develop, and that will then radiate out to the whole diaspora, and that it won't only be Jews who are living in Palestine who will experience a kind of rebirth, but Jews all over the world will benefit, especially spiritually. And so for him, I mean, he does start doing this in Eastern Europe. He thinks other Jews can start doing this in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, the United States. One of the pieces that we have is a letter he wrote to Judah Magnus, who was a major figure in American Judaism and what we might call American Zionism, although Magnus favored the creation of a binational state, that it should be nationally Jewish and nationally Arab or Palestinian. So as you can see, like, even thinking about Magnus, people have all different ideas of imagining what the Jewish future should look like. Haam thought, if there's going to be a Jewish state, that there doesn't necessarily need to be a state, that there only needs to be a kind of Jewish center and some sense of autonomy in Palestine, but if there is going to be a Jewish state, that Jews won't really be able to be a cohesive national community without this cultural renaissance in Zionism.